beautiful room. So, Aradhna, we've been hearing a lot about leadership these days, and you run a leadership institute that works with all different professions and age groups. 2 questions for you. What does leadership mean to you, and what's been on your mind about it?
Wow. Yeah, so first of all, it's a big privilege to work with and learn alongside leaders like Heather, you. And to me, leadership is a verb, not a noun. Titles don't make leaders. It's what they do that makes them leaders. And yeah, in terms of, we hear a lot of talk about leadership these days, right? I mean, whenever there is a phenomenally great leader on the scene or a phenomenally not so great leader on the scene, there's a lot of fodder for us leadership geeks. But what has been on my mind lately is what the parallels between leadership theory and cities.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but are you referring to leaders in the city leaders?
No, not quite that. What I mean is, so cities are being thrust into this position of leadership, right? I mean, they are the centers for innovation, sometimes social problem solution, and those are leadership responsibilities. So it's imperative that cities get savvy very quickly about sustainable leadership behaviors so that they can help the globe navigate the biggest population shift in world history.
Okay, so let's dive in. Can you tell me more about that?
Okay, so the cities occupy 2.6% of the Earth's crust, but 50% of the world population. And UN estimates that by 2050, there will be about 9.6 billion people on the planet, and 66% of them would be living in cities, which means, imagine, like about 6.5 billion people living in cities. So we think cities matter now, they're going to matter even more in the future.
Great. So cities are set up to be our laboratories for leadership and probably one of the largest ways to do a lot of good for a lot of people. What are the leadership principles that every city needs to know?
Lots of them, but this is the TED stage, so we'll try and focus on the 4 that I think are most important learnings from leadership theory for cities. The first one is that the best leaders are mindful leaders, not reactive. And there is some research in neuroscience that is being extrapolated into the practice of leadership. Basically, a mindful leader is one who is looking at not just the physical and material well-being of herself, but also of the emotional and social well-being and mental well-being of herself and her team and the organization she might be leading. So that's why Google is teaching meditation inside and out. Wall Street executives are now getting into mindfulness and meditation. Never mind the fact that Indian yogis have been practicing this for like a couple of centuries. But now that Google and Wall Street is doing it, it must be hip. It must be legit. So never mind that. But what do I mean by cities being mindful? We are not saying that we should all live here or all city people across the globe should live here and go and meditate in Market Square. That may not be a bad idea. But if what I mean by cities being mindful is that they have to stop being reactive. They have to go deep, look at their authentic selves, and see that if they're growing, are they growing in a healthy manner? Because if they're growing, and sometimes cities judge ourselves by numbers and others judge us by numbers, like other cities may judge us by numbers. But if we are growing by displacing those people who have lived in those cities for a long time, in the long run, it's going to cause grief, not just for those people and their families, but also for cities. Yeah, so let us be mindful that we are as as we are on that cusp of greatness, all of those kinds of cities, including our wonderful city of Pittsburgh, that that we are being intentional about the city we are creating, so that this moment of becoming promising doesn't also become the moment of our downfall. It's extremely important. There is a literary critic who said, the whom gods would destroy, they first called promising. Cities on the verge of becoming promising, watch it. Don't get so full of yourself. Don't buy into your own hype.
Okay, so you had mentioned 4 principles. And the first principle is the city needs to be mindful. What's next?
A city needs to be humble, humility. And maybe that's the way I was raised. I believe a lot in humility. But the connection between leadership and humility is as old as time. There is, we'll go back to that, right? Gods would destroy if you're not humble, right? So we need to make sure that we are reminding ourselves of all aspects of how do we remain humble.
And I think earlier we had been talking, there's some great examples in history. I know more contemporary with Enron, but also throughout history.
Yeah.
Any of those points you could maybe speak to?
Yeah, thank you for that. We were talking about the historical examples of like Kenley,
Sure.
about or was that the other one that we were talking about? I forget.
No,
we were
no, we were
talking
talking
about
about Ken,
so
yeah.
many examples back there. Okay.
We spent a lot of time together.
Yeah, so there is enough example of that lack of humility in the business world. In Kenley, as we were talking about, Kenley with Enron, just before the whole downfall of Enron, he's supposed to have sent an email which said something like, "We are the best example of American organization in the business world today," or something like that. And then, of course, this lack of humility is not just restricted to American business people. You can go back all the way to ancient China, 260 BC, which is the example that I think you found fascinating, which is that in the Battle of Shangping, the warrior prince, Zhao Kuo, is leading this army of about 500,000 soldiers, is about to win this battle, but wants to deliver the last crushing blow. So he rushes ahead, leaves his supply train behind, and so instead of winning the war against this much smaller army, he is imprisoned, beheaded within 46 days. His army, of the remaining army of about 400,000 people, soldiers, is left alone and starving and conquered and executed. All because of the ego of one man. Cities, be sure not to let that kind of hubris take you over.
Right, so Aradhna, aren't we told that often we need to be confident and celebrate our successes? But can celebration go too far? If you're talking about humility, what can a city do to become humble?
Okay, so that actually is a great segue into my third point. Tell the whole story, right? I mean, in leadership, we say that leadership, it's about balance. That leadership stories that speak only of successes are incomplete. So cities need to tell the full story. And what does that balance look like in leadership? So at the individual level, I have been privileged to be blessed to be a part of many successes. And both personally, individually, and through my organizational work, but there have been so many failures. You know, at the individual level, at the personal level, my marriage did not last beyond 20 years. There was a lot of pain. I have applied for jobs that I haven't gotten. I have hired and fired the wrong people. I have taken my organization into endeavors that were not that great. And so there are lots of things like that that others would consider failures and that I consider failures. Uh, and I've got to remember them and learn from them. But when you are kind enough to invite me to your TED stage, or or we get an award or something, we don't talk about that. So it's my responsibility to remember, to stay humble, to stay real, to have that balance at the city level. So Singapore, it's often hailed as an urban paradise, and it really is good. I was just there a few weeks ago visiting my son, and it's pretty and pristine and lots of trees and no crime and most millionaires in the world. But 10 to 14% of Singaporeans have trouble accessing their basic needs. Hunger is a real thing. Real cities have real problems. You can't wish them away. And you know, you got to focus on them. As the urbanist Liz Ogbu said at this recent P4 conference that was held in Pittsburgh, she said something about leadership that I'm going to take a little bit of a poetic license with. And she said, leaders, I add cities, leaders and cities need to be willing to listen to the pain, create space for grieving, and commit to healing. You've got to have that balance. You've got to be cognizant. You've got to own up to your challenges. A good leader is honest about her challenges, and so are good cities.
Okay, so if we buy the argument that nothing's perfect and there's always room for improvement, what's next? How do we get there, whether as an individual or a city?
I would say let's go back to that. Okay, let's go back to the fourth principle in my head. All right,
Okay.
so that's
be
because
open
that's a
about that.
beautiful segue into the fourth principle. Is how do we get there? That's about openness. And there is a lot of research in the business world about the diverse talent on teams makes the teams better, organizations better, corporate boardrooms better, and so on and so forth. So we'll not belabor that point. But at the geographical unit level, if we, a lot has been studied about rise and fall of civilizations. So let's look at China. We're going to pick on China today. I don't know why, but we are going to pick on China today. So China, scholars say that the most glorious days of China were also its most open days, when medieval Europe was racked with the purges of Muslims and Jews, because basically anyone who was challenging the Christian orthodoxy was being, purged out. China was opening its imperial court. Ships were coming in from Central Asia. Trade was flourishing. Cultural exchanges were happening. That's how Buddhism got into China, because of that cultural exchange and all of that. And the other cultures also benefited from that reverse exchange. But not only that, innovation was at its peak. The navigational compass was created then. The paper currency was created in China at that time. Gunpowder was created then. But then, same geography, right? And 14th century, imperial rulers decided that they wanted to curtail other influences on China. They wanted to protect it. And so they shut down the borders. the ships that had gone, they called them back and they cut them up for scrap. Whereas China had been flourishing in the open days, China started to fall behind. And at the same time, the Spanish and the Portuguese sailors were going, sailing the seas, and industrial and scientific revolution rippled through Europe. China was crippled. So what's the message for cities here? Being welcoming and inclusive is hugely important. And as we sit here in this beautiful city of bridges, I want to say to cities, build bridges to ideas and people, not walls.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So Aradhna, that's very interesting that you took us through the framework of what a city needs to do. Make sure I got this. Mindful, humble, balanced, and open. But as we look around the world today, it doesn't seem like those are the sort of leaders who are dominant right now.
Now that's a very interesting observation. Wouldn't have occurred to me, but here's the thing. In the short run, destructive behaviors can be successful. Sometimes even more than the healthy ones, but in the short run. But if we are talking about cities as leaders, cities leading the globe through that major population shift that's going to happen, then they have to be looking at the principles of leadership, which are the sustainable principles of leadership, or leadership sustainability. And that's why I point to those four. Be the mindful city. Don't buy into your own hype. Tell the whole story. The story of just the songbirds is just as incomplete as hearing just the stories of the crows. So tell the whole story. Build bridges, not walls.
Beautiful. So one final question for you. We're leaving here and we learn from the best of leadership. What do we gain as a society?
What does the society gain if the cities adopt the best of leadership principles? A more just society, a more inclusive society, a more equitable world, and a more caring and generous globe. So that, we sit here and talk about the China and scholars and history and all of that, so that if cities lead and follow these principles, my hope would be that 2,000 years from now, people, scholars, machines, computers are looking back at this, or some combination of humans and machines are looking back at this era and saying, they got it. That century got it.
Aradhna, that's the century, that's the world I want to live in. So thank you for your insight, and thank you for all that you do.
Oh, let's go create that world.
Let's do that. Thank you. Thank you.